nothing but relics left. And really until archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries really started finding remnants of Babylon, no one even knew it existed. And so what we have here is that the same message is being brought to bear. And so let's start with verse 1 of chapter 18. After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illumined with his glory. Why is that verse significant? Y'all remember all those college classes I used to teach? If they wouldn't answer, what do we have to do? Do jumping jacks. Everybody stood. Y'all don't feel like doing jumping jacks, I know, and I sure don't feel like leading you in them. So. Oh, okay. Carlin, they're pointing at you. To be our representative. Where's this?
So am I supposed to give an answer? Is that what?
Well, that was. Of course, you first have to hear the question, I guess. So.
What would you say that he's coming down out of heaven with great authority, and the earth is illuminated with his glory? Whose glory is this? I think
perfect.
I just heard somebody whisper at the
Perfect. The bottom line is, this is a voice of God. It's a royal decree which is going to completely eclipse everything else that the world's hearing at this time. Very good. Very good. I'm impressed. For some old coach in a Hawaiian shirt on Sunday morning, I am impressed. Verse 2, and he cried out with a mighty voice, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. Now, we've talked really for months. We've gone back and we've looked at Old Testament where it talks about the prophecy of Babylon falling, Daniel the 7th chapter, to which we referred to many times. And also we've looked at 1 Peter, the 5th chapter, where he talks about there's a Christian lady that is in Babylon, unquote. And we know that she was where? Where was Peter when he wrote 1 Peter? Starts with an R, ends in an E, and has an O-M in between there. I'll help you out. I'll help you out. Well, we've had a rough week at our house too, so I can understand it's kind of a tough morning. Peter's in Rome, about to be imprisoned and about to be executed, when he writes this, and he writes to these Jewish Christians and says, all these people send greetings, and one of them was a sister in Christ, says, who is in Rome, which is where he was. And so we know, again, we've talked about it so many times, Rome and Babylon are synonymous here. Now he goes on, he says, for all the nations have drunk the wine of the passions of her immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. Now, remember last week, we didn't get quite finished with chapter 17. If you'll skip back up to verse 14, he talks about, he says, these will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are the called and chosen and faithful. Now, do you remember from last week? And if you don't, it's certainly not your fault. We were flying through it trying to finish up. The 10 kings, who do we say they were? It's not Roman emperors. We've already talked about them. No, that's a good guess. So, to some degree, that's true. The 10 kings represent all these what we call vassal states that the Romans had conquered. And there's lots of internal and external evidence. That's who we're talking about here. And if you'll remember, we've talked about this many times before. The Romans realized they had conquered so much territory, there is no way in the world they could control all of it. So they made a deal with the rulers in all these, if you want to call them vassal nations or subjected nations or oppressed nations. Here's the deal. Here's the deal. And you remember what the deal was? Yeah, you do what we tell you to do, and you stay in these big, broad parameters of the rules that we put down, and we'll let you stay in power. And you can rule as long as, we call it that you're puppets. And do you remember in Israel? You mentioned Israel, and you're 100% correct there. Who was the dynasty that ruled Israel during this time. The Herods, yeah. Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, Herod Agrippa the first, Herod Agrippa the second, grandfather, father, grandson, and great-grandson. And every one of them, if you remember from the New Testament, every one of them did the bidding of the Romans. It didn't matter whether the bidding was right or correct. As long as they did what they said, they're going to stay in power. And the same thing for all their subordinates. And so it talks about here that these kings have basically been seduced by the Roman Empire. You do what we tell you to do, and you can stay in power. And so we see this very clearly as we go on down here, and it's going to talk about it all the way through chapter 18. I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins and receive of her plagues." Now, I mentioned a moment ago, folks, everything in Revelation has some relevance for us. There's nothing here. This is one of those eternal truths. What did the angel just say to the Christians in the first century here? Come out of her. What does that mean? Quit sinning. Yeah, don't participate in this ungodliness. There was plenty of that roaming around in Rome in the first century. How about today? How's that apply to us today? There ain't sin in our world today, in our society, in our community today? Not a bit, is there? Not a bit. Come out of her. Don't participate. You know, the scriptures use a passage of scripture of which we're all familiar, that we are to be, from the old King James, a peculiar people. Some people say, I don't want to be peculiar. But what's that passage mean? Don't look like the rest of the world. Yeah, very good. Don't look like everybody else. And I'm afraid that may be one of the greatest tactics that Satan used then and uses now. Hey, you don't want to look different. You need to participate in all these things that bring pleasure in life. And we're going to see that more as we move on here. Verse 5. For her sins have piled up as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. You know, I got a strong feeling that was very, very comforting to these Christians that are suffering so badly during the Roman Empire. What did that verse 5 just say? God knows. God knows. He hadn't forgotten. Now, we've already seen several times, he hasn't forgotten the Christian's way. He hadn't forgotten their faithfulness. He knows all that. He knows all that. But he also knows those that have opposed him and those that have aligned themselves with Satan. It was true in the first century. It's true today. God remembers. God knows. He says, pay her back even as she is paid, and give back her double according to the deeds in the cup which she has mixed, and twice as much for her. What did that say? I'm sorry, go ahead. Exactly. The retribution from God for those people that, remember, we've talked about over and over and over, God keeps giving mankind a chance to do what? Repent over and over and over. You glad that's the case? Well, this old boy is. I look back, I am glad that God is patient. I'm glad that God has forgiven me. I'm glad that God has given me a chance after chance after chance. He's doing the same thing. You know, back in chapter 6, verse 10, the Christians, they have this major question that comes up. What was the question back in chapter 6, verse 10? How long? How long? And the answer that we've seen in various and sundry ways is when God says enough, it's enough. And God says, you know, you've had chance after chance after chance, but sometimes the chances are gone. And we're seeing that right here. You remember in Hebrews, the 10th chapter, verse 30, we have a statement that really comes from Deuteronomy. God has a message. He says, vengeance is mine. What? Says the Lord, I will repay. And then if you think about verse 31, it says, it is a terrifying thing to fall in the hands of the living God. You know, that says God's going to take care of things. You just be faithful and God will take care of the rest. And we see that, I think, coming up very, very clearly here. Okay, he goes on, he says, to the degree she glorified herself and lived sensuously, to the same degree give her torment and mourning for the days. She says to her heart, I sit as a queen. This comes from Ezekiel, by the way, referring to Babylon. I sit as a queen, and I am not a widow, and will never see mourning. What's that verse saying? Oh, yeah. Rome, when you think about this, of course, we feel very confident this is AD 95 when the revelation is brought to people. What is the status of Rome in AD 95? They look like there's no bad days. Very, very wealthy, spread out all over the then known globe. A powerful military, a powerful navy, all these nations in subjection to them. They can't be beaten. You ever kind of look at that and say, evil seems to be winning? And that's what was going on here. But it's saying, this is their opinion. Now, way back in Deuteronomy, we hear the same thing, and it refers to Egypt. Way, way back, the oppressors of God's people. What happened to Egypt? They were humbled, to say the least. Same thing that happened to Assyria when they captured Israel. Same thing that happened to Babylon when they captured Judea. Same thing that happened to the Medo-Persians when they captured Babylon. Same thing that happened to Rome. Okay, now, let's get back to what we talked about earlier. How does that apply to us today? How does that apply to us today? I mean, you say it applies to you because you're a historian. But how does it apply to all the rest of us normal people? You weirdos that have all these dates stuck in your head mean absolutely nothing.
Great.
I'm sorry?
I would say it teaches us to trust God, because there's a lot of stuff that we don't know. And the beauty is, I often, because I think about these things too much, but I often think about the spiritual warfare from Ephesians chapter 6.
Yep.
He doesn't give us a complicated instruction. He says, stand firm in my strength. He's asking us, as he always has asked us, to just trust him. And we read through Revelations that God's going to take care of things.
Good point. Excellent point. Well phrased. Bottom line is, it tells us the same thing today. Evil appears to be dominant sometimes. Evil appears to be insurmountable sometimes, but it's going to disappear. And like I said, even though this is specifically here in chapter 18, focusing on the Roman Empire, because that's what those people do. You know, like I say, there's a lot of people who want to go and pull out Red China here, or North Korea, or Iran. Now, how would that play any role in the first century? Can you see that John saying, hey, don't worry, someday Red China's going to fall? But you know what? It is relevant because we know there's lots of evil in this world, and there's lots of evil empires in this world, and there's lots of evil people in this world. And the bottom line is same message. Trust God. Trust him. He's going to take care of it. He knows what's right. He knows what's wrong. And as long as you are faithful, guess what? You're going to win. You be faithful even unto death, and I'll give you a crown of righteousness. Revelation 2:10. Go ahead, sir.
What I was going to say is kind of follow up what you're saying, is that as long as you're faithful, you may come out of it battered and bruised up a little bit, but you'll come out of it victorious. And we will not go into it unscathed. We're going to have battle scars, as you always do in any battle. In a spiritual battle, it's going to happen the same as in physical. But as long as you're on the right side, and that's God's side, and not compromising any principle of God, or change it to appease mankind as we're doing today, you'll come out victorious. But otherwise, you're going to wind up on the devil's side.
Yeah.
And we know where he reigns.
Right. Very good.
I just wanted to add to that comment. You think about 1 Peter and the fire that tests us. That's the battle scar. And we need it. We need to endure and trust God because we need to be purified. And when we go through those kinds of trials, we begin to realize what is most important. That's if we trust in God, as Revelation is trying to teach us.
Very good point. You know, it brings to mind when you say that. There's a verse that I used to struggle with. I'll be real honest with you. James, the first chapter, verse 2. Count it all joy, my brethren, when you endure various trials. You say, well, that doesn't make any sense at all. Why would I rejoice when I'm suffering? I grew up with that. I thought, I know that's what I'm supposed to do, but I'm having a hard time, and sometimes still today, I have a hard time with that. But then he goes on in verse 3 and 4 and tells you exactly why. Why did James say you could rejoice? Because it's going to do what when you suffer? You're going to... That's right. It's going to give you... I mean, it's just like... Carden and I both were coaches, and both were athletes, and two-a-days, I didn't even like two-a-days when I was a coach. It was hot and miserable, and why'd you go through all that tough struggle in two-a-day workouts in August in full pads? Why in the world would you do that? It conditioned you. And there were some Friday nights, on a cool Friday night, that what you learned back there in August, took it with you. It made you stronger. It gave you confidence. And that's what I see us saying right here. Okay, then he goes on. Now this reflects back to what we talked about at the end of chapter 17, verse 9. And the kings of the earth who committed acts of immorality and lived sensuously with her will weep and lament over her when they see the smoke of her burning. Now all these vassal nations, they were rewarded not only with semi-autonomy, but they were also rewarded, we call economically, because Rome would trade with them. And all the wealth that Rome had acquired all over the world was shared with them. So they had trade, they had buying, they had selling, they had all this economic power, and he's going to refer to that here. Standing at a distance because of the fear of her torment, saying, Woe, woe, the great city, Babylon, the strong city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. Now, we've talked about this several times. 1 hour? Rome didn't fall in 1 hour. What's he saying? Short time. You know, we've seen this all the way through. And in fact, you remember when we were talking about God starts telling the saints, hey, you're going to suffer. Remember, for 3.5 months, 146 days, a time and a half, 42 months. You know, that was used throughout the early part of this book. And what he wasn't talking about, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, Christians aren't going to have to suffer but for 3.5 years. Rome didn't fall in an hour. It took several hundred years. But the whole message is, again, we've talked about that symbolism of apocalyptic literature over and over and over again. The bottom line is Rome's going to fall, and in the scope of history, this massive, mighty, seemingly omnipotent empire fell within a few hundred years. In fact, from this point, about 300 years before it really started its decline, which in the scope of history is what? A very, very, very blink of an hour. Short time. So he says this is going to happen, and these folks are going to, look at verse 11, and the merchants of the earth weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. What happened when the Roman Empire fell apart worldwide? Everything collapsed. All types of government collapse, all types of economy collapse, all types of social mores collapsed. In fact, if you remember, ultimately it led into a period of time that we call what? Dark Ages, medieval time. You know, a time where there's no law, there's no structure, there's no order. And he's given a little bit of insight here. He says, cargoes of gold and silver and precious stones and pearls and fine linen and purple and silk and scarlet and every kind of citron wood and every article of ivory and every article made from the very costly wood and bronze and iron and marble and cinnamon and spice and incense and perfume and frankincense and wine and olive oil, fine flour and the wheat and the cattle and the sheep and the cargoes of those horses and chariots and slaves and human lives. The fruit you pay attention to verse 14. The fruit you long for has gone from you, and all those things that were luxurious and splendid have passed away from you, and men will no longer find them. Now, that was true to these folks. It's true to us. What did he just say? What did he just say? Okay. Have you ever had something that you really treasured? You know, I read this, I think about the first year I coached. I'm single. I'm through with college. I've got a steady paycheck. I bought myself a brand new Ford pickup. Brand new Ford pickup. I was so proud of that. In fact, a buddy of mine said, "You're going to have to quit waxing that thing. You're going to wax all the paint off of it." Oh, that was the sharpest little Ford pickup you've ever seen in your life. I love that pickup. About 25 years later, it was parked in the barn. Had run in months and months and months. And my tractor mechanic said, "I'll trade you an overhaul of your tractor for that pickup." I snapped it up in a heartbeat. Now, what happened? What happened to that treasure that I had in 1981? What happened to it about 20 years later? It wore out. It broke down. You know, we're told that everything is going to, I like to put it this way, I paraphrase the scripture, everything's going to wear out, tear up, or get stolen. I was preaching that sermon one time, and an old rancher friend of mine says, "That sounds just like my operation. Wore out, tore up, or get stolen." That's just the thing. The physical things of life are not going to last. That's what he's saying right here. All these things, I mean, figuratively speaking, all these nations in the world had sold their soul for all these commodities and all, as he calls it, luxurious items. But now, when Rome's gone and all these items have lost their luster, what do they have? Nothing. Nothing. They're empty. And then he goes on, he says, "The merchants of these things who have become rich with her will stand at a distance because of the fear of her torment, weeping and mourning, saying, 'Woe, woe, the great city! She has been clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet,'" again a reference to immorality, "'and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in one great hour her great wealth has been laid waste. And every shipmaster and every passenger and sailor and as many as they live by the sea stood at a distance." For just a second, turn back to Ezekiel, the 27th chapter, because this has reference to an Old Testament passage that I think is very, very telling here. In Ezekiel, the 27th chapter, this again is Babylon. And one of Babylon's major trading partners was the city of Tarshish. You've heard Tarshish before. Where? Jonah. Yeah. They were evil. They were from the land that would have become known as Phoenicia. And if you know anything historically about the ancient world, the Phoenicians were the great seafarers. They kind of were the seafaring arm of the Roman Empire. And they took merchandise to and from Rome all over that Mediterranean world for years and years and years. And Phoenicia got unbelievably wealthy. It's because they did exactly what the Romans told them to do. Also, you may remember, there is an infamous queen in the Old Testament who came from one of those major cities of Tarshish, was Tarshish and Tyre and Sidon. And this prophecy that he's giving right here that we're about to look at in Ezekiel, the 27th chapter, is basically about Tyre. But one of the cities was Sidon. And the king of Sidon had a daughter that you never hear anybody name their daughter this. What was it? Jezebel. And we remember she married Ahab. And remember, Ahab was said to have done more to provoke God than all the kings of Israel who were before him, which was going to lead to the Assyrian capture of Israel. But just as bad as Ahab was, Jezebel was even worse. And apparently, as you look, she put Ahab up to a whole lot of the evil in which he participated. So here is this land, this prophecy against Phoenicia or against Tyre and against Sidon. And it says, you know, you're just like Rome. You're just doing what the Romans told you to. In fact, Ezekiel, in this case, the Babylonians, the 25th chapter of Ezekiel 27, he says, the ships of Tarshish were the carriers of your merchandise, and you were filled, and they were very glorious in the heart of the sea. What's that symbolism say right there? What's going to happen to all the seafaring power of Tarshish, of Phoenicia? It's all going to go to the bottom of the sea. It's going to disappear. Did it? Oh, yeah. Yeah. It did in the days of the Babylonians. When the Romans took over, they resurrected Phoenicia, and the same thing was going to happen to them. So we see that being made reference back here in Revelation, the 18th chapter. He says, if they were crying out as they saw the smoke of her burning and saying, what city is like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads, and they were crying out, weeping and mourning, and saying, woe, woe, the great city in which we all, who had all the ships at sea, again, Phoenicia, became rich by her wealth, and for in 1 hour she has been laid waste. Now, how does that prophecy about Phoenicia and prophecy about Rome, how does that affect us today? Go ahead. Exactly. Anybody, individually, collectively, that opposes God and his people, ultimately what's going to happen? They're going to be defeated. And anybody that is faithful to God, his people, anyone who, nations, entities that are faithful to God, what's going to happen to them? They're going to win. They're going to be victorious. Verse 20, rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints, you apostles and you prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her. Let's go back we've got several minutes. Let's go back to Daniel, the 7th chapter. We've talked about Daniel, the 7th chapter, over and over and over. To me, this is, again, as a historian, such a fascinating vision of Daniel. And this is about 700 years before Christ comes, when Daniel's making this. He has this dream. And I know you remember, Daniel saw the sea, and we said all along in apocalyptic literature, the sea always represented what? Evil. And he sees coming up out of the sea, he sees 4 monsters. You remember the first one? We said reflected back to an old Canaanite monster called Leviathan, which was a red dragon who had how many heads? 7 heads. Yeah, it had 10 horns. It's same demon that the Canaanites had all those years. And we said there's no doubt he was talking about at that point what empire? That was one of the 4. That was the 4th one. It was Babylon, yeah. Babylon was the first one he talked about, Leviathan. And then he saw another demon come up out of the sea, and that was what? The Medo-Persian Empire. And then he saw a third one that came up out of the sea, and that was what? Greece. We went back and looked at history and historical references. And then the 4th one, the really, really bad one, with the 10 heads and the 10 horns and the 7 heads, was what? Rome. And he talks about each one of them. Now, keep in mind, Babylon hasn't fallen yet when he has this vision. And the Medo-Persian Empire hadn't even come out of the Euphrates River Valley yet. And Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great, they haven't even come on the scene yet. And Rome is still a long way from becoming a world-dominating power. And yet he prophesies all this 700 years before it ever happens. And then he goes into great length talking about what's going to happen to Rome some way down, centuries down the line. And I'd ask you, Daniel 7, look what he says in verse 25. When he's talking about this fourth monster with In fact, look at verse 24. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom, 10 kings, does that sound familiar? Same terminology over in Revelation 18, will arise, and another will arise after them, and he'll be different from the previous ones, and will subdue 3 kings. Verse 25, he'll speak out against Most High, again, the monster, referring to Rome, and will wear down the saints of his highest one, and will intend to make alterations in times and in law, and they'll be given into his hands for what? Time, times, and half a time, which comes out to equal what? 3.5 years. We also see some places 146 or 1,460 days, and some places, we see the 3.5 months, or 42 months rather. But the court will sit for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away, annihilated, and destroyed forever. What did he just say in his prophecy about Rome hundreds of years down the road? It's going to be destroyed. Say, wait a minute, Daniel. It hadn't even come about yet. What does that tell you about our God? He's all-knowing. He's omniscient, isn't he? He's all-powerful. And we're going to see a point in just a second that even tells us more about this. Then the sovereignty and the dominion and the greatness of all his kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. His kingdom will be everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. Of all the kingdoms that the world has ever seen, what's the only one that's ever going to last for eternity? God's kingdom, Jesus' kingdom, the Lord's kingdom. And to me, again, as a historian, I read this whole 7th chapter of Daniel, and I think, how could you not believe? How can you not believe that God's in control, and God's all-knowing, all-powerful, and everywhere? Because everything that he talks about here in chapter 7 came to fruition or will. Now, let's go on here. And the sound of the harpists and the musicians and the flute players and the trumpeters will not be heard any longer. Remember, we talked about every time you hear a harp or singing, what does that say? Rejoicing. But in this case, he's talking about evil. And someday evil will not what? Will not rejoice anymore. And as I say, it's kind of hard for me to wrap my mind around it, but I love to try to think about it. No more evil, no more crime, no more vindictiveness. It's all going to be gone. And we'll see more of that as we continue through the rest of Rome, or through the rest of Revelation. And no craftsman of any craft will be found in you any longer, and the sound of a mill will not be heard in you any longer, and the light of a lamp will not shine in you any longer, and the voice of the bridegroom and the bride will not be heard in you any longer, for your merchants were the great men of the earth, because all nations were, I like this word right here, deceived by his sorcery. Now we're going to see Satan's going to be described here in Revelation as the deceiver of the whole world. You don't have to answer this out loud. But has Satan ever deceived you? Boy, he has me. He has me. And I look back sometimes, I think, why did I fall for that? Why? I know better than that. Like I said last week, if there's anybody that should not be a sinner, should be me. Because I was blessed by God. I was raised in a Christian environment for the moment I drew my first breath, and have ever since. And I'm still a sinner. I still make mistakes. And it's all for one reason. And I think that verse right there sums it up. Because I've been deceived by Satan. And in her was found the blood of the prophets and of the saints and all who have been slain on the earth. And you go back to what we talked about just a little bit earlier. Who knows all that? God does. God does. Have you ever had that hurting feeling within you? I wish God knew what he did. I wish God knew what she just said. He does. But he also knows about me. And that's kind of sobering sometimes in my mind. Okay, we're going to stop right there and not get into chapter 19 because we only have a couple of minutes. Any comments or questions? Again, I've moved very, very quickly. Anything you'd like to add this morning? Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry? Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm afraid it's not deserved sometimes, but I do appreciate it very much. Thank you all very much, and Lord willing, next Sunday morning we will pick up with chapter 19. Oh, thank you.